Good evening. My name is Mark Barnico, and I'm the Executive Director of the University of Chicago Francis and Rose UN campus in Hong Kong. Tonight, we continue our Director's Pick program with a new mini-series, Veblen's World of Luxury. Our UChicago expert will first introduce the American economist, thinker, scholar, and philosopher, Thorstein Veblen, who taught at the University of Chicago in the 1890s. In upcoming programs, we'll expand on this lecture by looking at other aspects of luxury markets and conspicuous consumption in Asia. Tonight, if audience members have questions to submit, you can do so through the questions and answer button by first registering on Zoom. I also encourage you to visit the UN campus website at www.uchicago.hk and subscribe to our e-news for the latest programs. We'll wrap up tonight's program with a poll and more information about upcoming events, so please stay tuned until the very end. Let's start tonight with a brief introduction of our speaker. Jonathan Levy is the James Westfall Thompson Professor of U.S. History, Fundamentals, Social Thought, and the College. He's also an associate faculty member in the law school, faculty affiliate in the Center for Study of Race, Politics, and Culture, faculty chair, Law, Letters, and Society, and a senior fellow, Society of Fellows in the Liberal Arts in the college. Jonathan Levy is a historian of economic life and of the United States, with interests in the relationships among business, history, political economy, legal history, and the history of ideas and culture. In addition to being a member of the Department of History and the John U. Neff Committee on Social Thought, he also has a current faculty director position of Laws, Letters, and Society program. His most recently completed book is Ages of American Capitalism, A History of the United States, which is a history of American economic life from British colonial settlement through the Great Recession. The book also is a single-volume history of the United States. Much of his recent research has sought to place investment at the center of economic history and theory, and relatedly to contribute toward the creation of Keynesian paradigm in economic history. Jonathan's currently working on 3 projects. The first is a book, The Real Economy, which collects a number of published and unpublished essays he's written over the past years on economic theory and history, with a focus on capital, corporations, and profit. Another book, The Fetish of Liquidity, is a revised version of a series of lectures that he gave in 2017 on global economic history since the Great Depression. The final project is a climate history of the city of Houston in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. He wrote a series of essays on this topic in 2019 for the Visualizing Climate and Loss project at Harvard's Center for History and Economics. Jonathan's first book, Freaks of Fortune, The Emerging World of Capitalism and Risk in America, won the Organization of American Historians Frederick Jackson Turner Award, Ellis W. Haley Prize, Avery O. Craven Award, and the American Society for Legal History's William Nelson Cromwell Book Prize. Jonathan, thanks for joining us from Italy tonight. I'll hand the stage over to you so that you can begin your lecture.
Okay, good evening to everybody. Thank you, Mark. I'd like to thank Mark, also Shannon, for putting together this series on Veblen. For me, it's a thrill. I mean, I'm a scholar of Veblen. Veblen's very important to my work as a historian, his conception of the economy, his conception of economic life. What I'd like to do in my remarks today is introduce Veblen's thought, his economic thought, but I want to do so by giving some sense of not just his work, but also his life. And to do this, I'm going to focus on one aspect of his life in particular, which is that Veblen grew up as an economist, as a scholar, literally alongside the creation of the modern American research university, and one research university in particular, which is the University of Chicago. So Veblen's life and work, but in particular in a setting at the University of Chicago, is really the subject of my talk. But I welcome any of your questions you might have about any aspect of Veblen's life and work. Now, today, Veblen is known as perhaps most often a sharp critic of elites, especially economic elites, from the leisure class, engaging in conspicuous consumption of time, conspicuous consumption of goods. I'll talk about all these terms in a bit, but also the captains of industry, as he called them in another book, The Theory of Business Enterprise. And I think this is right. Veblen was a critic of inequality. He was a critic of hierarchy. He was a critic of elites. I'm going to talk about his economic theory and also his social critique of elite consumption of luxury goods in this context. But it's also true that Veblen was himself a member of a new modern elite class, namely what was called in his day the professional academic. But not just the professional academic, but a professional academic at a particular kind of institution, and that's a wealthy private US research university employed by another class, these academics, called the academic executive, or the president of one of these universities, who Veblen called captains of erudition. And I think Veblen's experience at this kind of institution, a research university, and his analysis of this institutional type, both in his most celebrated book, The Theory of the Leisure Class, which is a book published in 1899, the last chapter of The Theory of the Leisure Class was about understanding universities in the context of conspicuous consumption, but also, especially in a book dedicated to the subject of the university. This book was called The Higher Learning in America. It was published in 1918. Thinking about Veblen's life and experience and analysis of the university, I think is an important key to understanding his thought and also entering it, including entering it for the first time, which I know perhaps might be the case for many of you this evening. With that said, Veblen also, I think, offered what's still today an important perspective on arguably, one of the most successful institutions of the last century, not just of American history, but really world history. And when you read Veblen's books, they're populated with many of the great kind of US business corporations of his day, of the turn of the 20th century. These names, which were notorious in Veblen's time, some of them are still recognizable today. Take a corporation like US Steel, perhaps. But most of these corporations, when you read his books, they don't exist anymore. You've never heard of them. That's not the case with this new institution of his time, which he also wrote about, namely the private research university. Names like the University of Chicago, but also Stanford University, Johns Hopkins University, all founded at this moment, or other universities were kind of reimagined at this moment, even if they existed for a longer period of time, like Harvard, Yale, or Princeton. Okay, so this is what I'm going to talk about. But first, let me just say a few words about Veblen's biography. He was born in 1857 to Norwegian parents in the state of Wisconsin. They were farmers. They worked the land. The family would move time and again. Eventually, they settled in Minnesota, and Veblen received his BA in philosophy at Carleton College in Minnesota, which was then and still is today an outstanding liberal arts college. Veblen would then enroll as a doctoral student at the first American university founded on what really was a German ideal of a quote unquote research university, and that was Johns Hopkins University. Johns Hopkins was founded in 1876, but Veblen would ultimately finish his doctorate at the first American college, which was Yale, that although for centuries had been an educational institution, a religious institution, a quote unquote gentleman's college, was the first American college to aspire to be a research university, granting doctorates in research disciplines, in which the point of the faculty wasn't just to teach or engage in the kind of pastoral care of the students, but was to engage in research, publish books, and also train graduate students in academic disciplines. Veblen received his doctorate in philosophy from Yale in 1884. He wrote a thesis on Kant. That was only the fourth PhD in philosophy granted by Yale, just to give a sense of how new this all was. In fact, in 1884, Veblen was one of only 5 men to receive a PhD in philosophy in all of the United States. And perhaps it doesn't need to be said, but I'll say it. No women received a PhD in philosophy that year as well. Only one of these 5 men who've earned a PhD in philosophy subsequently found academic employment, and that was Veblen's, former classmate at Johns Hopkins, John Dewey. And John Dewey is a celebrated and still widely known American philosopher. John Dewey's first job was at the University of Michigan before he was recruited to head the first philosophy department at the University of Chicago, which was founded in 1890. And there in 1894, Veblen joined Dewey at Chicago. Veblen was an entry-level instructor, although in the past decade, after recovering from an illness back home in Minnesota, Veblen had earned actually a second doctorate in political economy, which was the name by which economics still went. People didn't talk about economics until later in the 20th century. Veblen received a PhD in political economy from Cornell. And this is one of the things about Veblen. Veblen was a critic of American social institutions, as I said earlier, a critic of elites, which has often led many scholars to think of him as kind of an outsider, kind of a gadfly. But when you look at his biography, you see very clearly, Veblen was at the center of American academia, earning 2 PhDs, not just one, but 2, Yale, then Cornell, and now he takes a job at Chicago. Chicago, as many of you know, was founded in 1890, largely with the $3.5 million bequest from John D. Rockefeller, the oil businessman who was at that time the wealthiest man in America. 1890, with the founding of the University of Chicago, at that time, there's still only 7 American research universities: Chicago, Harvard, Yale. Cornell, founded in 1865 by a bequest from Ezra Cornell, a director of the Western Union Telegraph Company. There's Johns Hopkins, which I mentioned earlier, founded with a philanthropic bequest from its namesake, Johns Hopkins, director of a railroad. And then Stanford, founded by Leland Stanford, who gave the philanthropic bequest, another director of a large American railroad corporation. You can see a theme here. And in 1894, soon after Dewey and Veblen arrived at Chicago, Dewey wrote in a letter to his wife, "It seems to me the University of Chicago is a capitalist institution." And what Dewey meant by that was that Chicago's board of trustees, all of them great owners of wealth, had the power affirmed in the corporate charter of the university to govern it. Now, with that said, being what it was, a university, Chicago's institutional inheritance ran back deep in time to Europe, to Bologna, the University of Bologna, first university founded in the 11th century. Soon thereafter, the University of Paris, founded as the first faculty-centered university. And then later on, all of the religiously denominated colleges of British North America, and then the United States, colleges like Harvard, Yale, or Princeton. Chicago, I said, is new because it and Hopkins embraced the research university model, in which its professors principally conducted research and were not preoccupied with taking care of students or even teaching. What made a university like Chicago new on the world scene was really another factor, and that was its dependence upon new forms of philanthropic wealth. Its president, William Rainey Harper, worked for a board of trustees dominated by the men in Chicago who had funded and founded the university. And in the 1890s, nobody knew exactly, nobody could know how this new kind of corporate institution, the research university, would play out, if it could thrive. And for this reason, the great philosopher John Dewey wrote that the University of Chicago was also, quote, a place to make you appreciate at every turn the absolute opportunity which chaos affords. It's a new place. And Dewey and Veblen were what's called pragmatists philosophically. And to be a pragmatist at that time, and still today, meant that you believed that human beings were habit-centered creatures. Their habits were formed in the context of society and context of social wholes, but their habits are also in a constant state of evolution through time. I said Veblen joined what was called political economy still. Soon it would be called the economics department at Chicago. Today, after a century of history, the economics department at Chicago has a reputation for being in favor of markets, for practicing a certain kind of economics that analyzes market prices. This is a different moment. I mean, Veblen's there. He's thinking about how economies evolve over time, how the economy relates to society, and thinking of economy in a constant state of evolution and change. Now, within this predicament, within this pragmatist way of understanding things that Veblen shared, oftentimes human beings face new challenges for which their existing habits provide but incomplete guides. And therefore, they have to fashion new habits or new institutions. Veblen is often known as the founder of institutional economics, but Veblen simply defined an institution as, quote, a prevailing habit. So when society is changing, human beings have to change their habits and find new institutions that are suitable for the tasks at hand. And when they do that, they subsequently hand down institutions formed by their own lives to the present. So Dewey called this fundamental task, quote, maintaining the institutions which have come down to us while we make over these institutions so that they serve under changing conditions. So what better setting could there have been to kind of come up with this pragmatist point of view on life, on economy, than a place like the University of Chicago during its first decade of existence. An old habit, university life, an institution that existed for centuries under changing conditions for many reasons, this new research emphasis, but also due to the new influence on university life of what Veblen would soon call conspicuous consumption. Okay, so I mentioned Veblen. Let me now kind of transition to thinking about Veblen's, the kind of economics that Veblen created while at the University of Chicago, just departing from his biography for a minute and addressing his economic thought. Veblen was first hired in the 1890s to teach a class on socialism. And Veblen soon realized that he wasn't a socialist. He didn't intellectually identify with schools of thought like Marxism, but at the same time, he wasn't comfortable with what was a kind of new way of doing economics, which wasn't dominant in his day, although it would be later. And it's still, many would argue, the dominant way of doing economics today. And this is the context in which he wrote his book, The Theory of Leisure Class. Okay. So in economics, the theory of the leisure class was an attack, I think that's fair to say, an attack on what were called new marginalist economic theories of value and economic theories of distribution, which theorized that the distribution of wealth in society was determined by individuals' different marginal or the last unit of their contribution to production, whether it be contributions of their labor or contributions of their capital. Let me step back and explain a little bit about what this means and why Veblen saw the need to attack it. Basically this understanding of the economy, which Veblen named neoclassical economics, and it's still known as neoclassical economics today. It's a theory of relative value. What do I mean by that? It imagines the economy as an auction. So on one single day, different individuals come to an auction with goods to sell. And in the competitive process of exchange, given their wants, given what people want to buy, and given what they have to sell, and given their budget constraints or the amount of money they have to buy the things, given what they want to sell, there's a process of market equilibrium reached. So all in the same moment, and you can study this mathematically, economists did that then, they've done that today, through exchange, through market prices, we can reach equilibrium, a final state in which nobody wants to buy or sell anymore. Everybody is satisfied with what they've sold and what they've bought, and market prices and a process of competition as what determine that final equilibrium outcome. Okay, so it's an image of the economy based upon exchange, but based upon consumption, based upon what people want to buy through a process of market exchange. Veblen's critique of this image of the economy as the image we should start from when we do economics was twofold. First, it was static. So everybody comes to market on the same day, and given their existing wants, their existing preferences, or what's called their existing utilities, they transact and they buy and sell until all of the bargaining, all of the haggling is done. But Veblen was interested in how economies evolved across time. And he wasn't interested so much in the relative value of goods in market exchange. He was interested in wealth and property. So Veblen's understanding of the economy starts from the idea that sometime in the past, so we're already working in history, not in an abstract kind of auction context, that at some point in history, property, wealth was accumulated above subsistence, that there was a surplus. And the question became, who would own or control the surplus? And how would a new hierarchy based upon an unequal distribution of property and wealth be legitimated? Right? How did people think that those who own wealth, as opposed to those who did not own wealth, deserved to own the wealth that they did not? Deserved to own the wealth that they did versus those that did not. So very quickly, Veblen is thinking about inequality. He's not thinking about equilibrium and exchange. He's thinking about the inequality of wealth and property. And this is really what the theory of the leisure class tries to explain. That neoclassical image of the economy I gave, in which everyone's coming to the market, exchanging the goods that they have with one another, was extended to a theory of production. Now, right, some people bring their capital and some people bring their labor. Based upon how much capital or how much labor you have, how much it contributes to production, there's a market exchange, and everybody gets what they deserve, whether in the form of profits or the form of wages. Veblen was a critic of that theory of distribution, that theory of exchange, and he had a completely different theory of how the economy worked altogether. The point of the theory of the leisure class is to say that there's many elites, right, who have a lot of wealth, possess a lot of wealth in a social hierarchy, who are not making any contribution to economic productivity whatsoever. So it's not a theory of a marginal contribution to economy. It's actually a theory of waste. And this theory of waste works through his conception of how luxury goods fit into the economy. So let me say a few more words about that. In the theory of the leisure class, and then also in a second book, which I'll just mention, A Theory of Business Enterprise, Veblen sketches out his theory of the economy. And he starts by making a fundamental theoretical distinction between what he calls pecuniary and productive economic activities. So under the heading of pecuniary comes anything concerned with money, anything concerned with phenomena of value, with the individual quest for gain, with monetary purchase and sale, or with what he calls emulation. Emulation is really important to Veblen. I'm going to come back to that point. When he's talking in the theory of business enterprise, he also includes in the pecuniary things like financial speculation, business activities affecting bankruptcy, limited liability, monopoly, or mass advertising, and so forth. Now, for Veblen, ultimately, these pecuniary activities, the propensities, the instincts they cultivated in society were rooted in the institution of private property. So again, in the theory of the leisure class, Veblen argues that long ago, once societies began to produce a surplus of wealth, the possession of property and social status became tightly linked. In this hierarchy, owners of wealth at the top, non-owners of wealth at the bottom. Owners of wealth who do not have to labor are at the top. Those who have no wealth and therefore have to labor are at the bottom. So social distinction and social status becomes determined, he argues, by the display, the conspicuous display of wealth. Now, there's two ways to do this, Veblen theorized. And at this point, he's talking about America at the time in which he lived, the turn of the 20th century. One way to engage in conspicuous consumption is through leisure, by signaling to society that you don't have to work, right? That you can enjoy idle time. And Veblen argues historically, this is the dominant kind of aristocratic display of wealth. It's also tied to the institution of slavery, he argues in the book. Second, however, and given that the United States in the turn of the 20th century is an aristocracy, we're talking about a capitalist economy, the best way to signal status and social distinction in the ownership of wealth is through the display of goods through conspicuous consumption, displaying or signaling to others that you possess or own luxury goods is how you signal or express your status. Now, the basic idea here, and I think at this point it gets more subtle and complex, is that when acquiring wealth up and down the entire social hierarchy, the dominant motive is what Veblen calls a pecuniary emulation. So if you are at a lower status, the way to achieve a higher status is to purchase and display the luxury items that those above you in the hierarchy have bought and possess and display themselves. Emulation, Veblen argued, is the central kind of dynamic of a capitalist economy. To come back to a point I made earlier, this is very different from his foes within economics who argued, no, market competition, right? The process of competition, trying to lower costs, trying to lower prices, trying to find new markets is the dominant dynamic. And Veblen says, no, not competition, but emulation. And it's a process of emulation through consumption that never ends. And this is how individuals and groups experience inequality in a capitalist economy. It doesn't happen so much in the arena of work or the arena of exchange. Veblen's not a Marxist. Marx is a theorist of unequal exchange of labor. Instead, it happens in this arena of consumption. And it's also a social analysis, to go back to Veblen's pragmatism. He always holds there's social reasons that we might not even be conscious of ourselves, of why we want to buy what we want to buy, especially when it comes time when we do buy, and I think this is true for all of us, I would suspect, buy things that don't exist to meet our needs, but rather buy things that fulfill our desires, oftentimes our fantasies. When we buy those things, often it's because we're trying to signal to others where we see ourselves or where we'd like to fit in a hierarchy of wealth, property, prestige, and status. So Veblen here is coming up with really, I mean, this is one of the questions with Veblen, is this even economics? At that time, economics was there's a plurality of understandings of what economics is, whereas today we have a much narrow sense of what counts as economics. Veblen called his book Economic Theory. He was very clear about this, but maybe in our time, maybe the kind of easiest way to understand the way in which he was trying to analyze the economy is through a lens of social psychology, right? Many of us own a perfectly good pair of shoes, but we might still go out tomorrow and buy another pair of shoes. Why do we do that, right? What motivates that? And that's what the theory of the leisure class is trying to explain. In economics, still today, there's a name for the kind of luxury goods that Veblen was identifying. They're actually called, after him, Veblen goods. So a Veblen good is a good when the price goes up, right? Demand goes up. In kind of textbook introductory economics taught at the University of Chicago, probably everywhere today, usually when the price goes up, demand goes down, right? If thinking about a typical good, a loaf of bread, if the price goes up for the loaf of bread, less people want to buy it because it costs more. And if you're thinking again in terms of that kind of market auction as the kind of baseline for understanding what an economy is, how it works, I have a limited budget. And given that I have a limited budget, the price of bread goes up, I'm going to buy less of it, right? I can go buy, pasta here in Italy, right? And feed myself if it's cheaper. A Veblen good, by contrast, when the price goes up, the demand goes up. And hopefully you can see, given the analysis I'm describing, the price goes up, the demand goes up, because if it's more costly, that could actually signal to others that I possess greater wealth and status than they do. So Veblen used this analysis in many ways to kind of undermine or foil, again, what he called neoclassical economics. Okay, I mentioned Veblen had a kind of duplex view of the economy. This is one set, what he calls pecuniary institutions, and consumption, conspicuous consumption, is at the heart of that. But he also understands there to be a kind of second dimension of the economy as he knows it. And this is a dimension of the economy in which there's not pecuniary activities, but what he calls industrial and mechanical activities. Okay, the motive, the propensity to kind of stay in the social psychological register is not coming here from pecuniary emulation. That's conspicuous consumption. It's actually coming from what he calls, quote, the instinct of workmanship. Now, Veblen held, he was influenced, like many philosophers of his day, by Charles Darwin. Veblen held that society evolved through a process of contingency, right? There's no telos, there's no end. Nonetheless, individual conduct can be ends-based, right? It can have a purpose in mind. And that's what Veblen meant when he was talking about industrial and mechanical activities. These activities, I'm going to quote him here, let me find the quote, are not directed towards pecuniary emulation, but rather towards, quote, the shaping and guiding of material things and processes. This instinct of workmanship, an instinct towards creativity and production. And so Veblen held that actually, one of his critiques of society is these kinds of activities in monetary terms, in pecuniary terms, aren't valued as much as activities in this other sphere over here that have to do with conspicuous consumption. Just to add to that point, conspicuous consumption again signals pecuniary success, but it's also this form of waste, right? Waste is a really important word for Veblen. It doesn't contribute anything productive to the community at large, unlike the instinctive workmanship, which does. And take it together, the theory of the leisure class, and also this second book, which I've been drawing from a lot, called The Theory of Business Enterprise, conclude that the pecuniary, what he called pecuniary activities, not socially beneficial workmanship, were quickly becoming, at the turn of the 20th century, quote, the controlling factor about which the modern economic process turns. That's Veblen's critique. That's also his concern and worry. And I mentioned conspicuous consumption. It's certainly probably the leading edge of Veblen's critique. But he also had a critique of many other forms of economic activity that were not, according to him, productive, not following this instinct of workmanship. And in addition to conspicuous consumption, undoubtedly, the other economic practice that drew Veblen's ire was speculation, was financial speculation, which again generated pecuniary values. And if you think of the kind of herd behavior in financial markets in times of bubbles or stock market booms, is another kind of dimension, or another iteration, I should say, of this process of pecuniary emulation, not competition, that Veblen saw as being at the heart of modern capitalist economies. Okay, so that is a brief, perhaps all too brief, a summary of kind of the core aspects of Veblen's economic thought. Now let me transition to the third and final part of the talk, which is to talk about Veblen's theory and understanding of the university, and how the university expressed or not this dynamic of either conspicuous consumption, bad, or instinctive workmanship, good, or actually expressed the third kind of human propensity, the third kind of economic institution, and then what Veblen made of that. Okay, I'll catch my breath. Both of these books that I've mentioned, both the theory of the leisure class and also the theory of business enterprise, had a last chapter. And the last chapter in each book applied the economic analysis to the American Research University. The theory of the leisure class, if you read the book still today, has that last chapter in which Veblen critiques private wealthy colleges for, at times, not always, it's a very subtle critique, for being a form of conspicuous consumption. I'll talk about that some more in a second. His second book, The Theory of Business Enterprise, actually Veblen did not publish that last chapter, and writing it cost Veblen his job at the University of Chicago. He was fired. After Veblen was fired, he wrote a letter to a colleague, another economist. This is what he said. I'm quoting from Veblen's papers here. I had left over from the manuscript of the book on business enterprise, this second book, a somewhat long chapter which offered an analysis of the workings of business enterprise and the administration of a university. This chapter eventually I proposed to publish as a separate small volume, and in search for a publisher, the manuscript came into the hands of the president of the University of Chicago, William Harper, who was apparently not pleased with it and seems to have seen in it some reflection on his regime at Chicago, which it definitely was. So in 1904, Harper, president of the University of Chicago, fired Veblen. He used the pretext, a rumor of an extramarital affair that Veblen had with a student at the University of Chicago, which was actually not true. He didn't have that affair. Veblen left Chicago and found a job at Stanford University, where he was fired again, this time for a romantic affair that he did have with a student. And after being fired from Stanford, Veblen's academic career, and really his economics too, there's a kind of conjoined story here, went into a tailspin from which it really never recovered. Veblen ended up teaching at a business school at the University of Missouri. He was part of a group that founded a new university at the time in New York City called the New School for Social Research. He worked there for about a year or two, but at that point his age was increasing and he had to retire before in the 1920s. Veblen died. Okay, this chapter, eventually Veblen did publish as a freestanding book in 1918. It's called The Higher Learning in America. Harper, the president of Chicago, killed the publication of this book in 1904 when he fired Veblen. Veblen tried to find a publisher, but then Harper died very young himself in 1906. And Veblen would claim that as a matter of decorum, as a matter of respect to Harper, he held off publishing the book, but he did finally publish it in 1918. Okay, let me talk about this book, The Higher Learning, and what to make of it, which is somewhat of a puzzle for Veblen scholars, how to fit it into Veblen's economics. Veblen begins The Higher Learning. He states 2 points. First, that the American Research University should be understood as a business corporation. Now, it's true, the University of Chicago was classified legally, then, still today, as a nonprofit corporation, which is actually a new American corporate type, first emerged in the 1870s to be distinguished from the for-profit corporation. But again, if you think about Veblen, his definition of the economy doesn't really have much to do with profit. It has to do with the accumulation of wealth and property. And because the university accumulated wealth, a lot of wealth, even if in the form of philanthropy, Veblen thinks this is part of the economy. We have to understand the university as being part of the economy and therefore vulnerable to pecuniary culture, vulnerable to pecuniary culture. The second point, by contrast, was that nonetheless, the university, I'm quoting Veblen, is a corporation of learning. It is disinterested. And this is because the profitless quest for knowledge has come to be the highest and ulterior aim of modern American culture. So Veblen never really explains why this is the case. why in a culture given over to so much pecuniary emulation, pecuniary values, nonetheless, the profitless quest for knowledge has come to be the highest aim of modern American culture. Okay, one possibility here is that Veblen understood the university. We go back to kind of Veblen's duplex view of the economy, that the university isn't just in pecuniary culture, it also belongs to workmanship, right? Workmanship is this part of the economy that produces things of social and economic value to society as a whole. But here Veblen says no, because actually workmanship is ends oriented. So if I wanted to, in front of me here is a table here in Italy that I'm going to guess was probably built sometime in the 13th century. Okay, you're building a table, it has an end. You want to create something and you have that end in mind, right? The table, right? That's workmanship. And of course, the table is productive. It's social, it's of social value. We could sit here, I could give this talk, we could have lunch, we could have dinner, we can use it, right? The university research, what faculty members do is something different. Veblen calls it the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake. Actually, the instinct behind academic research, Veblen says, is idle curiosity. Okay, when you hear idle in Veblen, it makes you think about idle time. It makes you think about conspicuous consumption. Okay, so the university doesn't belong to workmanship, because when a scientist at the University of Chicago engages in research, right, you might not necessarily know, right, what kind of invention, what kind of discovery you're going to create. You don't have the end in mind like the table. You're doing research, you're pursuing knowledge for its own ideal sake. But to do that, you have to be motivated by idle curiosity. So then there's the risk, right, that the university becomes a form of conspicuous leisure in which faculty and students sit around, they don't engage in productive activity. It's an institution that's accumulating wealth. It becomes a way to display that you belong in a higher position in a social hierarchy because you're a professor or you're a student at a place like the University of Chicago, which has accumulated a lot of property and wealth. So Veblen's really stuck when he's thinking about the university. Where does it belong in his scheme of thought? And what's the best way to understand it? As a part of the economy, part of pecuniary culture, or as kind of a third institution that has to go somewhere else? Now, a lot of the book is a critique of the fact that the university, which really should belong over here, idle curiosity research, is actually being absorbed into pecuniary business culture. He emphasizes that the universities are subject to a process of pecuniary emulation. Who has the largest endowment? Who has the biggest, most expensive buildings? Who has the highest enrollment? How much of the university's budget is going towards generating publicity for the university and not towards actual instruction or actual research? A lot of the book a lot of the book tries to explain this threat that the university could be absorbed into what he calls marketable illusions, which give the illusion of visible success from what he calls the standpoint of the counting house. With that said, Veblen always comes back to the point that actually there's limits to how much the university can be absorbed into pecuniary culture, because university faculty, to carry out research, must be given what he calls a free hand to control their time and a free hand to do research. And that really, this kind of forms a central tension or contradiction of the modern American research university, which I should say still today, inarguably is still the case. I mean, I'll just speak truthfully here for a second. As a tenured member of the University of Chicago, I have an extraordinary amount of free time, free hand to do my research, to think about what I want to write, what I want to say. It's true that Veblen was fired because he wrote this book and argued that the university was at risk of becoming absorbed into capitalism too much, a threat to the research mission of the university. But it's also true that Harper, and here many scholars have written about this, that it's true, William Harper, the first president of the University of Chicago, was a strident advocate of free expression, of free speech, values that are still very important to the University of Chicago today. So it's both, and it's both at the same time. And Veblen was thinking through how to make sense of these tensions. And at the end of the day, he really saw the academic executive as the figure who had to kind of bear the burden of these tensions, who we called the captain of erudition. Always torn between a different set of values, given the business dimension of the university, given how much it fit into pecuniary culture, while at the same time trying to fulfill the mission of the modern research university. So Veblen wrote in this book, I'm quoting, "The dominant note of the official life of a university administrator necessarily must become that of ambiguity. So a process of competitive emulation among universities determines the direction of budget expenditures that have bad consequences for research. Yet at the same time, there's some understanding that there's a space within a university that has to be protected and kept free from pecuniary values." Let me say just a few words about that space. And then I have one more thought after that. And then I'm going to stop and we can take your questions. Okay. There's a section in this book where Veblen says, well, what is the ultimate value of a university in a modern capitalist society? Why should an institutional space funded by wealth, funded by philanthropy, being pulled out of pecuniary processes in the economy, why should it fund an activity, or excuse me, a space for activities of, quote, idle curiosity and the disinterested pursuit of knowledge? What is the use of this learning? And Veblen critiqued, I think, a tendency which is still prominent today, that, and I'm quoting him here, men who speak for higher learning, and even scholars occupied with, quote unquote, the humanities, are often at pains to answer this question, what is the use of learning, and seem to try to find some kind of answer that shall satisfy the worldly wise, that all of this learning for which they speak is in some way useful for monetary gain, that the university has some immediate payoff, some immediate instrumental value. Veblen wrote in response to this argument, he wrote, and I'm quoting, Benjamin Franklin, the hybrid pragmatist that he was, once put away such a question with the rejoinder, what is the use of a baby? Now, Veblen says, speaking of children, a child used to be a way of having an article of equipment for the upkeep of the family and its prestige, and remotely for supporting the sovereign, right? In prehistoric, not even prehistoric, in a feudal economy, you had more children because you needed more labor for the farm to make sure that people could survive. But now Veblen says civilization has reached a point where a child born is not rated as a means, but as an end. This, I think, is actually Veblen's ultimate critique of conspicuous consumption. And I said Veblen earned a PhD in philosophy at Yale with a thesis on Kant. And I think here we can see his philosophical and moral commitments. Kant once wrote, freedom, what is freedom? It's the absence of dependency on others. Freedom is the obedience to the law that one has prescribed to oneself. Freedom is autonomy. And the problem with conspicuous consumption is we go around buying things, not because we want them, not because we can give ourselves reasons for why we want them, but because we're being outer-directed towards society's understandings of status and rank. So that's kind of one point. The second point is, well, Veblen, Does that mean that leisure, right, idle leisure, not working, is always going to be absorbed into this social process of emulation and hierarchy? And I think when Veblen thought about the university, he saw a kind of leisure, idle curiosity, which was not absorbed into these kinds of invidious distinctions. He wrote, idle curiosity at the university is closely related to the aptitude for play, and that higher learning was a species of leisure immune from the process of pecuniary emulation, right? So what is the use of a baby? There's no use. A baby, a human being, is an end in and of itself, and the university is an end in and of itself, which exists to shelter a kind of intellectual aptitude for childlike play in an intellectual form among students and faculty, but nonetheless was always at the risk of being overly absorbed into the pecuniary culture that funded it, right, through philanthropy that actually gave it the wealth to exist as such. I had a few more thoughts about economics, but maybe we'll see what kind of questions come up about kind of how Veblen's economics related to the future trajectory of economics, both at the University of Chicago and also later. So I think I'll stop there. And thank you for your attention. I look forward to trying to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Professor Levy, thank you so much. That was such a wonderful overview of Veblen, his life, his works. There are questions that are coming in about the impact today, and I was wondering if you could speak to that. Just what would Veblen think about of the world that we live in today, both the economic world that we live in, as well as the world of education that we reside in?
Right. I mean, I guess I would say maybe three things to that. I mean, first, Veblen was a critic of inequality, and again, the reason he was a critic of inequality had to do with his philosophy and his commitment to a certain vision of freedom, and that we can't be we can't be free as individuals unless we exist in the right relationships to our peers. That there has to be a certain level of equality in the economy before we can be free. And so he'd be a sharp critic of inequality, and he would be a sharp critic of how processes of conspicuous consumption legitimate existing hierarchies of wealth and income. Now, with that said, and a number of scholars have tried to update Veblen's thought today, but have kind of pointed to the fact that conspicuous consumption as an activity has kind of migrated into all kinds of unexpected activities. So Veblen talked about two things: leisure time, right, displaying to others that you don't have to work, and then second, the consumption of particular goods, luxury items. So today we could think of, read about cars, private jets, particular kinds of branded goods, apparel, shoes, etc. It seems today that there's actually new kinds of activity that signal where one belongs in a social order. It's not just through consumption. It could be other aspects of lifestyle, what kinds of food one eats, but not necessarily the most expensive meal, but certain foods one won't eat, to kind of mark that you belong within a particular social group or not. Or politics, right? We could think of the context of the United States, kind of polarization in the political sphere and party affiliation in some parts of the country as kind of signaling to others, here's what I see my social status as being, who I vote for, the kind of political opinions I have. So I think there's a kind of migration of that social dynamic outside the purchase of goods into other registers. Third, as far as the university goes, I mean, I'm struck. And as I said in the beginning of my talk, that when Veblen went to the University of Chicago, it was 4 years old. I'm struck how much his description of the University of Chicago in 1894 accords to my experience of it today. On the one hand, Veblen was a sharp critic of the importation of business values into the university, but he also defended the university as really as really promoting something unique and valuable that could never be completely kind of conquered by wealth. And I think that that's still right, that that's a tension that's had many chapters since Veblen's time, and we're in a new chapter of it today. And I would have many of the concerns about the future of the university that Veblen had then. But at the same time, there is this other thing that Veblen celebrated, which is intellectual life and learning, that still exists. Like there still is a space in the university where it's protected and that can happen. And that's something this is my job, so perhaps you won't be surprised to hear me say this, deserves to be protected and defended.
As I listened to your talk, it seems to me that Veblen had more influence on the way universities have evolved over time since he introduced these theories than he has necessarily on economic theory. And I was wondering if you could just speak to that. One of the questions from the audience had to do with, he is not typically considered to be someone who was a contributor to the Chicago School of Economic Theory and Thinking.
Yeah, it's a great question. The history of economics at the University of Chicago, to a large degree, tracks the history of economics as a discipline in the United States across the 20th century. As many scholars have said, before World War II, the scene was dominated by pluralism. There's sort of multiple traditions of how to do economics and how to define the economy. And Veblen's position was not an outlier at all, but was one of the main positions within the American economics profession. And I think if Veblen would have kept his job at the University of Chicago or even at Stanford, that could have made a difference because he was very influential. He had a very long following. After World War II, there's a number of changes, which I don't have time to go in here. It's a real break. And you see two traditions of doing economics, which are actually quite similar. And in fact, just how similar they were, even though they were considered polar opposites, comes to define economics. The first comes out of MIT, and it has to do with the reception of Keynes in the United States, the birth of Keynesian macroeconomics, and its integration or its synthesis with microeconomics defined as a theory of markets and prices. And then the second, a critique of that school, which is located within the University of Chicago. That's the University of Chicago, not of Veblen, but of Milton Friedman, George Stigler, and other important economists who taught there later. So I guess the way scholars think of this is there's been multiple Chicago schools. Veblen is kind of a first Chicago school. It's connected with pragmatism. It's connected with a kind of integrated understanding of the social sciences. Veblen drew from sociology, psychology, history, also anthropology. World War II, we're in a new Chicago school, which is defined more so by a commitment to the study of market prices and a political commitment to free markets, a critique of Keynesian macro. And then, maybe I'll stop the story there. I'll be talking all day. But yeah, Veblen is kind of the first chapter in Chicago economics, but it's not the next chapter.
Yeah, that's an interesting point that you make, because I wrote down one note. You said that Veblen looked at economies and how they evolve across time. And it seems to me that in listening to you talk about Veblen, he was really addressing that quote unquote gilded age of a capitalist society, where people then flaunt their wealth. We say new money. And there's an evolution, right? So we evolved away from that. But if you actually apply his theory to other parts of the world, like Asia, maybe that's a more recent part of the history that we've been experiencing here. And the level of wealth that's been generated or created in Asia being more at the beginning of the curve in terms of evolving as a capitalist society, the Gilded Age, corruption that occurs. I'm just wondering if you could speak to some of that. It's a little bit of a big question, but wondering if you could.
No, it's a great remark. I mean, for two reasons. one, I'll get to your question in a second, but actually you really raised an important aspect of Veblen's thought that I didn't mention. And that's that, Veblen was not he studied economic history carefully. He thought economic history was important. But he wasn't a stage theorist of economic history. He didn't think there was a traditional economy and then a one-off transition to a modern economy or an industrial economy that kind of left the past behind. Part of Veblen's understanding of history is that the past kind of lives on and is sedimented into the present and into the future. And a lot of the behaviors of the kind of Gilded Age America, which is a capitalist economy, he saw as a kind of carryover of aristocratic leisure practices from the past, which then were transformed in a new setting. And that also, the kind of Darwinian that Veblen was, that there was no kind of telos, right? He's not a Marxist. He doesn't believe that there's going to be capitalism and then an inevitable transition to communism. Instead, it depends on, what happens next. And what happens next could look a lot like what happened before, because what happened before still exists within the present kind of social formation. So you're exactly right. I mean, in the 1960s or 70s, in a place like the United States, right, we thought, oh, the Gilded Age, inequality, kind of unregulated capitalism, that's all been overcome, right? The economy has modernized, and we now live in a different world. There's no going back to that. That's not what happened, right? We talk about kind of Gilded Age in many Asian societies today. In the United States, we talk about a second Gilded Age because there's been a return of inequality, socioeconomic inequality in 2020 that looks a lot like what existed in Veblen's day in 1900. And this is one of the reasons why his thought, I think, is so relevant today. And we see this dynamic of conspicuous consumption reappearing in the context of the reappearance of inequality. And then, of course, I think you're right, too, that because his analysis, did not, unlike many Western thinkers in 1900, well, we're modern, we're Western, this applies to us. It could never apply to a place like Asia, but he doesn't have that theory. So I think he was able to see things at the time in the United States that make his thought applicable to different societies today, not just in the United States, but around the world. And so it's quite appropriate to be talking about his theories in the context of what's happening with Asian economies today.
I know we have a hard stop here, but I have one more question for you. And it comes from some of the questions from the audience, but it's something off the back of what you just said. Did Veblen have an answer, a response? Like, how do we move out of this, conspicuous consumption phase? Or should we be thinking about him more as a economic philosopher, and that he had a philosophy that we should be embracing so that we don't spiral out of control with all of our appetites?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's kind of two answers there. First has to do with politics, and Veblen was a critic of Marxism. He was a critic of socialism because he thought they had the wrong theory of the economy, that Marx had a theory of labor exploitation as the root of surplus value and inequality. And he thought that on scientific grounds that this was not true. And in many respects, he developed this theory as an alternative to it. With that said, there's no question that in terms of politics, that Veblen would be in favor of a redistribution of wealth to create a kind of basic level of equality in society. I don't think he would have been so excited about things like basic income or a kind of more extreme forms of tax redistribution. I think Veblen thought wealth was at the center of the economy, wealth and capital. So if you wanted to have more equality in the economy through political means, you would have to find ways to redistribute and tax wealth. That's definitely in Veblen. The second piece has to do with culture and civilization. And again, this has to do with his historicism, that these pecuniary values of emulation kind of emerged over centuries, kind of in the transition from feudalism to capitalism. and that there's going to be a long process that would likely last for many centuries through which society had to develop a new set of values, a new set of institutions that would place greater priority on what he called the instinct of workmanship, as opposed to peculiar emulation. And I think there, undoubtedly, and it's one of the reasons why I focused on it in my remarks today, Veblen saw education and universities as really being, at the center of that struggle. And it could go either way, right? I mean, he saw universities could completely just become a way for people to engage in conspicuous consumption by thinking of, I got my degree at Stanford, and that makes me at the top of a hierarchy. Or a university could be a place where faculty and students, cultivated a kind of new set of values that could balance, compensate, and perhaps one day supersede, the values of what he called a pecuniary culture.
Well, we have many people asking to read Veblen's books, but they actually are online. You can listen to them free. Mm-hmm. Having listened to some chapters out of Veblen's books, it is a bit of a struggle. And so maybe you can share with our team, and we'll post on our website registration page some articles, some papers, some other books that can help us, better understand Veblen and his writings and his thoughts in contemporary language. So thank you so much.
Veblen's writing is tough, and it's part of trying to create a science out of economics. But I think with Veblen, every once in a while, a kind of sentence or a formulation grabs you. So I think you have to kind of just read along with it, understanding that maybe everything doesn't quite settle in. But usually by the time you finish reading a chapter, that there's always a sentence of his that's very striking and insightful, that kind of things click. That's my experience, at least.
That's so true. And I encourage people to read his works. Thank you so much, Professor Levy. This has been great. It's such a stimulating conversation. It's the thought-provoking conversation. I hope we can have you back sometime in the near future to talk about Veblen and some of his theories and thoughts more in the future. I think they apply very much to the world we live in today, and especially apply to the world we live in here in Asia.
Great. Thank you all very much.
All right. Our pleasure.
Take
Have
care.
a great day.
Bye.
And for those of you that are still with us, I wanted to talk a little bit about the programs that we have coming up next week. We do have a Zoom poll that's going to be on the screen here as I recount to you what we're doing next week. We have a 4-day workshop. I mentioned this last week on our program on population movements, language, contact in East Asia and Southeast Asia, and evolutionary linguistics. You can find the dates and the times on our website, www.uchicago.hk. And I also wanted to give a shout out to the staff idea that we came up with here to do a podcast. I'm not sure if I mentioned it previously. It's called The Course, and it features the career journey in academia our UChicago faculty took to become scholars. And I hope that we can get Professor Levy to actually be one of the guests that we interview on the Course podcast. You can find the Course podcast on Apple, Spotify, or Himalaya in the mainland, the podcast platforms. And you can also find it on our website, as I mentioned, www.uchicago.hk, the UN Campus website, under the Digital Resources tab. And then finally, we're launching it on YouTube soon. So you'll be able to find the podcast on YouTube as well. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Have a great weekend here in Hong Kong. It's a holiday weekend, and have a wonderful day wherever you may be. Thanks so much for joining. Good night.